Most people believe that winning against dishonest people requires becoming just as ruthless as they are. That assumption is exactly what gives manipulators their advantage. They expect emotional reactions, impulsive decisions, and predictable behavior because those responses are easy to exploit. Ideas commonly associated with Machiavelli suggest that true strategic power begins when you stop reacting on instinct and start observing with intention. Every manipulator leaves clues through their behavior long before revealing their real objective. They test boundaries with small lies, subtle disrespect, and calculated pressure, waiting to see how you respond. If you defend yourself too quickly, they learn your insecurities. If you explain every decision, they discover how to challenge your confidence. If you become emotional, they gain control over the direction of the interaction. This is why mentally disciplined people rarely rush into confrontation. They understand that information is more valuable than immediate victory. Instead of exposing their own thoughts, they quietly collect details about the other person's motives, habits, and weaknesses. They recognize that patience often reveals what aggression never can. Outsmarting someone mentally is not about deception for its own sake. It is about refusing to become predictable. It means knowing when silence is stronger than argument, when distance is wiser than revenge, and when calm observation produces better outcomes than emotional retaliation. The strongest people are often underestimated because they do not advertise their intelligence or announce their strategy. They allow others to become overconfident, believing they have already gained the upper hand. Meanwhile, they continue thinking several steps ahead, protecting their emotions while carefully evaluating every move. Over time, this quiet discipline changes the balance of power. Manipulative people lose influence because they can no longer predict your reactions or exploit your emotions. Your confidence no longer depends on proving yourself, and your decisions are no longer driven by fear, anger, or the need for approval. This is where genuine mental strength begins, not in overpowering others, but in becoming someone whose mind cannot be easily manipulated, distracted, or controlled. Once you master that foundation, every psychological tactic used against you becomes easier to recognize, and every decision you make becomes guided by clarity rather than emotion. The moment you understand that manipulation begins with emotion, you start seeing people differently. Dirty players rarely attack you directly because open conflict carries risk. Instead, they slowly guide your emotions until you begin making decisions they wanted you to make all along. They provoke your anger so you speak carelessly. They trigger your guilt so you apologize unnecessarily. They create confusion so you begin questioning your own judgment. Before long, you are no longer responding to reality, but to the emotional state they carefully created. Ideas commonly associated with Machiavelli suggest that the person who controls the emotional climate often controls the outcome. This is why emotionally disciplined people refuse to react immediately, even when they feel justified. They understand that the first response is often emotional, while the best response arrives only after the mind becomes calm. Most people never develop this discipline. They believe defending themselves instantly proves confidence, but it often proves the opposite. The need to explain every decision, justify every action, or answer every accusation quietly reveals insecurity. Manipulative people recognize this immediately because someone desperate to be understood is often willing to give away information that can later be used against them. Mentally untouchable individuals behave differently. They know that not every accusation deserves an answer, not every misunderstanding deserves correction, and not every challenge deserves participation. Sometimes silence forces other people to reveal their real intentions. Sometimes patience exposes contradictions that endless arguments only hide. While emotional people rush to protect their reputation, disciplined observers continue collecting information. They notice changes in tone, inconsistencies in behavior, and hidden motives beneath polite words. Over time, these patterns become far more valuable than winning a temporary disagreement because they reveal who can be trusted and who cannot. Another habit separates strategic thinkers from ordinary thinkers. They never confuse appearances with reality. Manipulators often present themselves as victims, helpers, or loyal friends while quietly pursuing their own interests. Average people judge these appearances. Strategic people judge consistency. They compare promises with actions, words with behavior, and intentions with results. If those pieces fail to match, they trust the pattern rather than the performance. This habit protects them from countless disappointments because they refuse to ignore evidence simply to preserve comforting beliefs. As your awareness grows, your confidence changes as well. It no longer depends on convincing everyone that you are right. Instead, it comes from knowing that your judgment is based on careful observation rather than emotional impulse. You become slower to trust but quicker to understand. You stop wasting energy defending yourself against every false narrative because you realize that truth eventually exposes what arguments never can. Most importantly, you begin recognizing that every dirty player depends on one thing above all else: your emotional participation. Without your anger, their provocation loses power. Without your fear, their intimidation loses influence. Without your need for approval, their manipulation collapses completely. This is why mastering your emotions is only the beginning. The next step is learning to see the invisible psychological games before they fully develop, because once you recognize the strategy behind someone's behavior, you stop reacting to the move and begin understanding the player. Once you understand how manipulators control emotions, the next lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The most dangerous psychological attacks are rarely loud or obvious. They are quiet, patient, and designed to make you question yourself instead of questioning the person creating the confusion. Ideas commonly associated with Machiavelli suggest that the greatest victories are often achieved before the other person even realizes a battle has begun. Dirty players understand this principle well. They know that direct confrontation invites resistance, but subtle confusion creates dependence. They mix compliments with criticism, kindness with disrespect, and truth with carefully placed lies until you no longer trust your own judgment. Slowly, your confidence begins to weaken. Not because they are stronger than you, but because they have convinced you to doubt yourself. This is why mentally disciplined people never make important decisions while emotionally unsettled. They recognize that confusion is often created intentionally. Instead of rushing to resolve uncertainty, they step back and observe the entire situation from a distance. They ask themselves whether the facts support the story they are being told, or whether emotions are being used to replace evidence. This single habit protects them from countless psychological traps because manipulation depends on emotional urgency. The faster someone pressures you to react, decide, forgive, or explain, the more carefully you should examine their motives. Strategic thinkers understand that time exposes what pressure tries to hide. They refuse to allow urgency to replace clear thinking. Another habit strengthens their position even further. They never reveal every card they hold. Most people speak openly about every plan, every ambition, and every weakness because they believe honesty always creates trust. While honesty remains valuable, unnecessary transparency often creates vulnerability. Manipulative people quietly collect every piece of information you reveal. They remember what frightens you, what excites you, what frustrates you, and what you desperately hope to achieve. Later, those same details become tools for influence. Mentally untouchable individuals avoid this mistake. They share thoughtfully rather than impulsively. They understand that privacy is not secrecy, it is protection. By revealing less, they become far more difficult to predict. Other people are forced to judge them through actions instead of assumptions. This uncertainty quietly shifts the balance of power because unpredictability limits manipulation. At the same time, disciplined observers continue learning about everyone around them without feeling the need to reveal themselves equally. They understand that listening often teaches more than speaking. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to study character, priorities, and hidden intentions rather than simply exchanging opinions. Gradually, they become skilled at recognizing patterns long before problems fully develop. They notice when someone's words consistently conflict with their actions. They recognize when repeated promises never produce meaningful change. They identify when kindness appears only during moments of personal benefit. These patterns become their guide instead of temporary emotions. As a result, they make fewer impulsive decisions and far fewer avoidable mistakes. They stop being surprised by predictable behavior because they have trained themselves to observe rather than assume. This level of awareness creates genuine psychological strength. Dirty players lose their greatest advantage because they can no longer confuse, pressure, or emotionally overwhelm someone who refuses to abandon reason. Instead of becoming trapped inside another person's game, you begin seeing the rules behind it. And once you can clearly recognize the game itself, you are ready for the next lesson, the discipline of using strategic distance, where sometimes the strongest move is not advancing at all, but quietly allowing others to reveal themselves while you remain completely in control. By now, you have learned that dirty players succeed by controlling emotions, creating confusion, and collecting information that others reveal too easily. But there is another psychological weapon that is even more powerful because it requires almost no effort at all. It is the ability to remove your attention. Most people underestimate the value of attention because they give it away freely. They argue with people who cannot be convinced, chase those who have already made their decision, and continue investing energy into situations that stopped benefiting them long ago. Ideas commonly associated with Machiavelli suggest that power often belongs to the person who is least dependent on the outcome. The less emotionally attached you become, the more clearly you are able to think. Dirty players understand the opposite principle. They want you emotionally invested because emotional investment creates predictable behavior. When they know you desperately need their approval, they can withhold it. When they know you fear losing them, they can threaten distance. When they know you cannot tolerate uncertainty, they can create confusion whenever they need leverage. Their influence exists only because your emotions remain attached to their actions. Mentally untouchable people quietly break this pattern. They stop giving unlimited access to their thoughts, their time, and their emotional energy. They recognize that every moment spent chasing someone else's validation is a moment stolen from their own growth. Instead of asking how to make people respect them, they begin asking whether those people deserve access to them in the first place. That simple change transforms every relationship they have. They no longer tolerate repeated disrespect simply to avoid loneliness. They no longer explain themselves endlessly to people determined to misunderstand them. They no longer waste months trying to change individuals who have repeatedly shown no intention of changing themselves. Rather than fighting for acceptance, they quietly redirect their energy toward building a life that no longer depends on external approval. This does not make them cold or indifferent. It makes them selective. They understand that attention is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses because whatever receives your attention eventually shapes your thoughts, emotions, and behavior. For that reason, they choose carefully where that attention is invested. They spend it on learning instead of arguing, on building instead of complaining, and on observing instead of reacting. As this habit becomes stronger, something unexpected begins to happen. Manipulative people lose interest because they can no longer create the emotional reactions they once depended upon. Their tactics become ineffective when they receive no emotional reward. Instead of pulling you into endless psychological games, they are forced to search for someone more easily controlled. Meanwhile, your own confidence continues growing because it is no longer tied to circumstances outside your control. You discover that walking away from unnecessary conflict is often a greater demonstration of strength than winning the conflict itself. Protecting your peace becomes more valuable than protecting your ego. Every decision becomes guided by long-term clarity instead of short-term emotion. Over time, this creates a reputation that cannot be manufactured. People recognize someone who remains calm under pressure, difficult to provoke, and impossible to manipulate through fear or approval. They understand that your silence is intentional, your boundaries are real, and your attention must be earned rather than expected. This is where psychological freedom truly begins. And once you reach that level of discipline, only one lesson remains. The lesson that brings every strategy together and reveals why mastering yourself will always be the greatest advantage over anyone who chooses to play dirty. Every lesson in this journey points toward one final truth. Outsmarting people who play dirty is never about becoming more deceptive than they are. It is about becoming so mentally disciplined that their tactics no longer affect your decisions. Most people believe victory means proving someone wrong, exposing every lie, or winning every argument. Yet those victories are often temporary because they keep your attention focused on the other person instead of your own direction. Ideas commonly associated with Machiavelli suggest that the greatest strategic advantage belongs to the individual who cannot be emotionally controlled. The moment someone realizes they can no longer provoke you, confuse you, or manipulate your choices, they lose the very weapon they depended on from the beginning. Dirty players survive by creating emotional chaos. They need you to become angry, desperate, defensive, or fearful because people rarely think clearly in those emotional states. Mentally untouchable individuals refuse to surrender their judgment to temporary feelings. They understand that every emotional reaction has a price, and that the most expensive reactions are often the ones that feel justified in the moment. Instead of asking how to defeat every manipulator, they ask a more powerful question. Is this situation worthy of my attention at all? That single question changes everything. It shifts your focus away from proving yourself and toward protecting your peace. It reminds you that time, energy, and emotional stability are limited resources that should never be wasted on people committed to misunderstanding you. This perspective creates remarkable freedom because you stop measuring success by other people's opinions. You begin measuring it by your own consistency, your own discipline, and your own ability to remain calm while others lose control. As your thinking evolves, you discover that real confidence is quiet. It does not need endless explanations because consistent actions eventually speak louder than temporary accusations. It does not chase revenge because revenge keeps your attention connected to the very people you should have left behind. Instead, it continues moving forward while others remain trapped inside resentment, comparison, and emotional conflict. This is why mentally untouchable people appear so difficult to influence. They have trained themselves to pause before reacting, observe before judging, and think before deciding. Every challenge becomes another opportunity to strengthen discipline rather than weaken it. Every disappointment becomes a lesson instead of a permanent wound. Every betrayal becomes valuable information about character rather than a reason to abandon wisdom. Slowly, this mindset transforms the way you experience life. You stop fearing criticism because it no longer defines your worth. You stop fearing rejection because your identity no longer depends on acceptance. You stop fearing manipulation because you have learned to recognize its patterns before becoming trapped inside them. This is the highest form of psychological strength. It cannot be borrowed, purchased, or performed. It is built through countless moments where you chose discipline instead of impulse and clarity instead of emotion. In the end, the greatest lesson is surprisingly simple. You do not become mentally untouchable by controlling other people. You become mentally untouchable by mastering yourself so completely that no dishonest person can redirect your mind without your permission. Circumstances will continue changing. Difficult people will continue appearing. Manipulation will always exist in one form or another. But once your principles become stronger than your emotions, and your judgment becomes stronger than your ego, you carry something that cannot easily be taken from you. True freedom, true confidence, and a mind that remains calm, strategic, and impossible to defeat long after everyone else has exhausted themselves playing games that no longer have power over you.